Today we're making a monument to Yamcha.
Sorry I'm late.
The GOAT of Dragon Ball Z at dying. Yamcha's most iconic death comes against the Saibamen when the Z fighters are facing Vegeta and Nappa on Earth, which has become an internet meme for futility. So get ready for the iconic Yamcha Impact Crater of Death. The main material that I'm using for this project is 2-inch XPS foam, and I'm using a handheld hot wire cutter to cut out the edging for this, before swapping out the head for this for the next phase of carving the foam, where I use the hot knife to score the line work of some of the stone carvings that we want. Now this isn't going to be the final look for the stone carvings, but it's going to give us the basis as we move through the project, and you can already see how things are shaping up. At this point in the build, I don't have a Yamcha figure, so I use Spider-Man as a stand-in as I use my compass to create a perfect circle, which is going to be the outline for the impact crater. Now it's time to get a fresh blade so that I can start carving into the foam in a circular motion to create the impact crater radius. I think a lot of people either don't know or don't remember, but before this moment in Dragon Ball, Yamcha was actually a really cool character and pretty relevant in several fights and story arc. More on our hero later. For now, we're gonna go with my Ryobi rotary tool, which is a super powered rotary tool that I love to use for things like this, where I'm going to carve into the foam, and I make sure that I wear a sanding mask and some goggles because you do not want to breathe this stuff in or get it in your eyes. Time for sanding. As you can see, the surface for this starts out really rough, so I use a rougher grit sandpaper, and then as I get it to be more fine, I go down to a more fine grit and smooth it out so it's as smooth as Krillin's beautiful bald head. I always have my shop vac handy to suck up all the fine dust from sanding. When I'm texturing terrain, I always use a combination of a rolled up ball of tin foil and a real rock from my backyard. And when I'm doing that, I do a combination of pressing and rolling motions to get the terrain look. And now it's time to carve the striations of the crater, which I'm going to do with a V motion of the knife. Trying to be really intentional about where I place these and reference the image that we had in the beginning of the Yamcha Crater to make sure that I'm doing this justice. If you've never seen Dragon Ball, the original Dragon Ball, I really suggest that you go back and watch that because there are some really cool Z Fighter moments and relevance that just don't happen in Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball Super for that matter. And I have to say, so far I'm really happy with the way that this is looking. We all know Yamcha for dying during fights, but believe it or not, he never died in the 5 seasons of Dragon Ball. This was his first death during a fight in Dragon Ball Z. In fact, in classic Yamcha overconfidence, right before he fights the Saibamen, he tells Krillin to stand down because Krillin's been wished back by the Dragon Balls and Yamcha never has, and he's so sure that he's going to be victorious. But we all know what happened. It didn't quite work out that way for him. Rock texture can be a tricky thing, so one of the things I like to do is score the sides of the rock formations to get a more realistic look. At this point, I thought the build looked too symmetrical, so I broke out my hot knife with this longer attachment to kind of give it more intrigue. My goal here was to add another level to the diorama to make it kind of look less uniform, and so we could place other figures in that area. This doesn't actually appear in the scene in Dragon Ball Z, but I'm taking a little bit of creative license here just to have a little bit of fun with this build. And I'm really glad I decided to do this. I think it looks great. This next portion is something I'm doing for the first time after watching Boylai Hobby Time use this in so many of his incredible builds. First, I put 2 parts of Plaster of Paris in this mixing container, and then I put 1 part of water in that container, before adding in some paint to make sure that I can see where I'm applying this stuff and mixing it thoroughly. We all know Krillin as Goku's faithful best friend, but did you know that we get introduced to Yamcha way before we meet Krillin in Dragon Ball? And just to prove that Yamcha is relevant in Dragon Ball, the first time he meets Goku, they fight, and Yamcha actually holds his own pretty well against Goku, landing his famous Wolf Fang Fist attack and knocking Goku through several different rock faces into this pile of rubble. Okay, back to the build. So the reason that I'm using the Plaster of Paris is to add some durability to this and also fill in any of the imperfections that can happen when you carve into foam. Since this was my first time, I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I will say I thought this might make the piece way too heavy in the end. It did add some weight to it, but it did not make it overly excessively heavy. And speaking of excess, I actually made way too much Plaster of Paris. Lesson learned. I let this dry for a good 12 hours before applying extra terrain texture with aquarium rocks and several different grains of sand. In hindsight, I probably should have mixed the sand in with the Plaster of Paris mixture because that would have given me a more reliable hold on the sand particles, but there's always next time. I've always been told to start with the larger grains of these aquarium rocks and then seal those in before adding in the smaller grains. So this is kind of like my medium level grain, and then after I'm done, I get the sifter out and I use my smaller grains to kind of fill everything in and make it look nice and, I guess, natural. And once again, this needs to dry before I go ahead and do the next step, which is going to be base coating this before painting on the detail. In my mind, the easiest way to paint this is to airbrush it because of all the fine sand particles that could come off if I was trying to use a brush to paint the entire thing. So I get my mixture right, and then I break out my Iwata airbrush. Now, another Yamcha moment that I think people forget about is after he dies and he goes and he trains with King Kai, the Ginyu Force are all defeated pretty much by Goku, and they arrive in the afterlife as well. Yamcha matches up against Raccoon while Tien fights Birder and Jace, and Chaozu takes on Gildo. Yamcha does incredibly well against Raccoon, completely defeating him, which is pretty remarkable when you consider how much of a problem Raccoon was for the rest of the Z fighters on Namek. I'm just doing some light dry brushing to kind of get a sandy or more desert terrain look on this piece. The terrain in the Saiyan saga of Dragon Ball Z has a reddish kind of hue to it. I want that to come through, but this is a little bit too red or orangey for me, so I'm adding in some lighter tones so that I can still have that undertone, but it's not overpowering. And in case you're wondering, I had 3 Vallejo tones that I used for this paint project. One is flat earth, the second is ochre brown, and the third is desert sand. I'm mostly focusing on the edging for the lightest tones. The very last thing that I do on this project is add my washes. I'm using a brown wash on all the rubbled areas, and I also off camera do the brown wash in the crack work of the crater. In addition to using a brush, I also use a little squirt bottle to get some of those areas a little bit more soaked in. And with that, I'm gonna consider this diorama complete. The only thing really left to do is add our hero, Yamcha, into the diorama. And I need to give a special thanks to my friend Poncheesy for allowing me to borrow this figure for this video. And even though we're looking at dead Yamcha in the impact crater, I hope you have a new appreciation for who Yamcha is as a character and how cool and relevant he actually was. And while we're all looking at shots of Yamcha, I want to take an opportunity to thank my new friend Lionsbrush, a fellow YouTuber who really encouraged me to up my quality for my video, audio, and everything in between. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and checking out the video in the top right. I think you'll enjoy it.
Vasco Toys. Action figure dioramas and props.